Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to come speak to y'all, and I appreciate everybody showing up to hear what I have to say. So, first of all, I think it's always, I have to show this picture. Whoa. What? Oh, wait. No, go for it. I have to show this picture of me and the man himself. So this is back from 2000. I was working at OSTP, and I was the staff atmospheric scientist there. The OSTP, by the way, is the Office of Science Technology Policy. So that's the White House Science Office. The President's Science Advisor is the head of it. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk to you today is stuff that I became interested in while I was working there. And I'll sort of put some more threads of that idea as we go through the talk. But even though I'm going to talk about the policy debate, I always like to start my talk with a few conclusions. So if you just pay attention the next 5 minutes, then you can go to sleep, and I think I will at least have imparted important information. Number one, the Earth is warming, and there's essentially no doubt about that. Okay, I mean, scientists are as certain as scientists can be that we're in the midst of a multi-decadal warming. And it's about a degree and a half Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like a lot, but I'll explain in a minute why that is a lot of warming. Humans are now driving the warming, at least on long time scales, not year-to-year variability, but we're in the driver's seat, we got our foot on the gas. Likely warming in the 21st century is 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, double that for Fahrenheit, so 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a huge amount when you talk about the global average. So if you ask yourself, how much warming have we had since the last ice age? It's about 5 degrees Celsius, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you think you just cool the climate by 10 degrees Fahrenheit, you get an ice age. And we're sort of on the road to warming the climate by a comparable amount. And so if that happens, we will truly remake the surface of the Earth. I mean, think about how much different the planet is now compared to the last ice age, and you get some idea of the scale of the changes that will occur if the warming if the worst case happens. And again, the impacts of this are severe. I mean, human society as we know it, with billions of people on the planet, mega cities with millions of people, industrial agriculture, that's only, we've only had that world for 100, 200 years. And over that time, the climate has not changed very much. And so the kind of changes we're predicting for the next 100 years are going to be completely outside the realm of what human society as we know it now has ever experienced. And so that, more than anything else, should just should compel your attention. Okay, so that's sort of the science. I'm not going to talk any more about science. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but by the end of the talk, you'll see why I'm not going to talk more about science. There's actually a very good reason for that. But instead, I'm going to talk about what I call the alternate reality. So this is a slide from a screen capture from a Star Trek episode where Kirk beams down to the planet, and then when he's beaming up, there's a transporter accident that sends him into this alternate reality. And you can see in this alternate reality, Spock has a beard. And he's evil Spock. He's just like Spock, but he's evil. And so the point I'm going to make is that there's reality science, which is what the scientific community does. So we've been working for 200 years to establish a very well-documented theory of how the climate system operates. And there's still some things we don't know. There's a lot of things we know very well. And then next to it, there's this parallel reality that doesn't actually correspond to real science, but it's out there. And so it's sort of, so you can think of real science as Spock, and then Spock with a beard is this alternate reality. And so I'll explain in the next 30 minutes or so, what this alternate reality is, and then I'll explain why it's generated as a way to hopefully give people some tools to interpret what they hear in the debate. So to really understand the alternate reality, we have to go back a few years. This is 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General report on smoking. So Surgeon General Luther Terry put this out. And this was really a bombshell. In it, I don't expect people to read that, but you can read that. They say cigarette smoking is associated with a 70% increase in age-specific death rates of males and to a lesser extent with increased death rates of females. They just didn't have data on women at that point, but the women died just as fast with smoking as the men do. And basically, this was 1964, probably 10 years after the science was really established. The big longitudinal studies in the 50s showed that smoking was terrible for your health. And so, you ask yourself, well, what do you think the cigarette companies did with this? Did they say, okay, guys, you got us. This is killing people. We're gonna admit that. Of course, they did not do that. They said, how do we fight this? And so luckily in the 90s, there was a huge amount of litigation in which tobacco company documents were released, and they were all scanned and uploaded. And so you can actually go through and see what were the memos that the tobacco companies were writing about this. And again, I don't expect people to read this. I'll read this. So it says, we must, in the near future, provide some answers which will give smokers a psychological crutch and a self-rationale to continue smoking. These answers must also point up the weaknesses in the report. So basically, they laid out the roadmap that people would use to fight every environmental issue, which is you attack the science, basically. That's the tobacco playbook. And right now, the people that attack climate science are going through it page by page. And hold on, let me go back. Do we have sound on this? All right, let me go forward.
Yesterday, the government released a new report on smoking and health, which said that there is overwhelming evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and is a major factor in heart disease. The tobacco industry says that there is no conclusive evidence that smoking causes cancer or heart disease. Yesterday, we discussed this new report with the United States Surgeon General, Julius Richmond, and John Pinney of Health, Education, and Welfare. And this morning, Bill Dwyer, who is Vice President of the Tobacco Institute, is with us, and Steve Bell joins our conversation from Washington. Good morning, Mr. Dwyer.
Good morning, David. Thank you very much.
But if everybody made the choice to quit smoking, then, of course, there wouldn't, let's say, be any more tobacco industry. So it's in the interest of the industry to keep people smoking if they're going to continue to make a profit. Why should the public believe you as opposed to believing the Surgeon General and all the doctors and the reports from the government?
David, I don't think it's quite so much a matter of believing us versus someone else. It's believing what the facts are. And the facts shouldn't all come from a single source. It isn't really just our statement of contradiction or difference with the Surgeon General. There are many independent men and women of science who don't believe that the causal conclusion yet has been reached. David, we don't deny that there is statistical evidence. Smokers in greater number than non-smokers do fall victim to these various diseases. But we must remember that, for example, most smokers don't develop lung cancer, and certain non-smokers do as well. We think it's an open question.
So there's a couple points to realize. First of all, this is 1982. Now, this is an audience. When I show this to my students, none of them remember David. Is it David Hartman? Is that his name? Yeah. Nobody remembers David Hartman on Good Morning America. So maybe some of you guys remember him. So that's number one. I don't feel quite as old. Number two, this is 1982. This is 30 years after it was established. I mean, the scientists knew for decades what he says is not right. But yet they're still pushing this idea that there's this dispute among scientists. There's this uncertainty. You know, there's some scientists that say this, but there's some scientists that say this. Who knows? But let's not do anything while we're waiting. And so this is a major theme, this idea of doubt, generating doubt. And so this is one of the most famous memos, 1969, written by some cog at Brown and Williamson. And they basically say, doubt is our product. And so this is a really famous, so there's a book called Merchants of Doubt. That comes from that quote, and so you understand that this is really the strategy. You know, we want to attack the science and attack the science. We don't want to win the argument. Again, it's like a defense lawyer. You don't have to prove your client is innocent. All you have to do is prove he's not guilty, and that's essentially the tack they're taking. Now, because this was so successful, I mean, realize it was 40 years from when scientists realized smoking is bad in the 50s. And you could even make arguments they knew it before then. But the big longitudinal studies were done in the 50s. It wasn't until the 90s that they were really able to get the tobacco companies to acknowledge it. So it took them 40 years. So this is a very successful strategy by any measure. And so it didn't escape the notice of the people who are smart that they could adapt this for other approaches. So this is a memo by Frank Luntz. So he's someone who does language So for example, he was the one who they took the estate tax, which if you call it an estate tax, is completely everybody kind of agrees, yeah, estate tax is fine. He called it a death tax and found there was widespread opposition to it, a death tax. So that's the kind of stuff he does. And so he does these pollings, he does polls and tries to figure out how to sell ideas that are terrible. And so basically what he says, and again, it's kind of hard to read, so I'll read this for you. He says, the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. And so this then begins to get to the idea of why do you create an alternate reality? You create an alternate reality because you want to give people who are sympathetic to your idea, who don't want to believe climate change, you want to give them some support. You want to give them something that they can say, oh yeah, well, you're citing this scientist. I've got a scientist over here. He says the exact opposite. So who knows what to believe? Let's just wait. This will get settled some other time, some later time. And so then the question is, what are the techniques to do this? All right, so first of all, the first thing you have to do is you have to attack the legitimate science. So there is a huge, maybe not a huge, there are a lot of scientists out there that are actually studying the climate, and you basically have to attack them. You have to sort of convince people that you can't trust the experts. So this is something from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. All aboard the climate gravy train. And they say things in here. Therefore, it is fair to ask just how well rewarded are climate scientists. As it turns out, by some measures, they are paid as well as corporate CEOs. And then they just have, you just wonder where they come up with this stuff. Atmospheric Earth and marine space science teachers, post-secondary, earn considerably more than the average university teacher. They also work less hours, and despite their low workload, pull down about $104,000 a year. I have no idea where these numbers come from, but I know how much people are paid at Texas A&M, and the College of Geoscience, we get paid more than the College of Liberal Arts, that is true. We get paid less than the College of Engineering, we get paid less than the College of Business. There's no basis in reality for us being paid as well as CEOs. They won't get tenure if they don't get along. These are arguments. Oh, they're left-wing socialists. So you actually see there's a real strain of thought that environmentalists is the next communism. So, for example, here's a book cover by James Dellingpole. There's a joke. What's a watermelon? No, what is it? So an environmentalist is like a watermelon, green on the outside but red on the inside. And it's a joke, but they actually believe that environmentalism is, we've beaten communism. Environmentalists is the next threat to freedom. And in fact, that's explicitly talked about by Václav Klaus, who was an Eastern European politician. He was president or prime minister of some country. Czechoslovakia? All right. Yeah. So, and what he said was, he actually comes right out and says it, the largest threat to freedom, democracy, the market economy, and prosperity at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century is no longer socialism. It is instead the ambitious, arrogant, unscrupulous ideology of environmentalism. And so, these people honestly believe that environmentalists are going to destroy the world. And I think if you are able to convince people of the immorality of your opponents, then that's one way to say, you shouldn't listen to them. These people are immoral. And in fact, this is one of my favorite ones. This is, I still believe in global warming. So Ted Kaczynski's the Unabomber. In case you know him, and apparently he really is very concerned about global warming. And so the argument here, there's really no argument here. It's just basically saying this guy believes in global warming. How can you agree with him on anything? And everybody who believes in global warming is somehow morally equivalent to the Unabomber. Heartland, I'll talk about them more. So one of the big arguments is they're immoral. So these are all ways to attack people. And the last one is. All right, so this is Lamar Smith. He's head of the Science Committee in the House. So this is a panel, that's me. If I'm about to barf, there's a good reason. There's Lamar Smith. There's Brian Shaw, who's head of TCEQ, the Texas Council on Environmental Quantity. John Nielsen Gammon, my colleague in the Atmospheric Science Department, he's also the Texas State climatologist, and Jim Marsden from EDF. So we're doing this panel, this is about 2 weeks ago at the Texas Tribune Festival. And so we'll listen to I think hopefully this will play if I click this.
Quickly.
Okay, let's go back. This is Lamar Smith explaining his definition of science.
Quickly. Let me go back to the beginning, because I know we have good scientists with us today, and just remind everybody of what the scientific method really is. A good scientist is going to admit that, one, they want their hypotheses challenged. A good scientist is going to say there are a lot of variables. A good scientist is going to say, I have little certainty about anything because I continue to push and continue to challenge what I'm doing myself.
All right, so think about what he said. So the first two I agree with. You know, a good scientist does want to have a hypothesis challenged. You know, a good scientist does acknowledge complexity where it exists. But this third point, it's kind of like, you know, 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4, 3 + 3 is 7. You know, he's just trying to slide it by. You know, he says a good scientist says we don't know anything. That's not what a good scientist says. I mean, science is the systematic pursuit of generating knowledge, and ideas that get tested and retested and retested, you come to accept as being true. You know, we know quantum mechanics is true because we've been testing it for 100 years. We know the Earth is round. I mean, there are things that scientists are certain about. And so what he's essentially done is he's redefined science so that the people that he gets the answer he wants, which is we don't know anything. And in fact, I'm not going to play the whole talk. You can listen to it if you want, but have a barf bag handy. So I said that's not right. He basically says, you know, you don't sound like a scientist. You sound, you know, do you believe in the scientific method? And he said, you don't sound like a scientist. You sound like an environmentalist. And he really meant that as an insult. I mean, that to him is really, to call someone an environmentalist is really an insult. But the point is, he's basically redefined science.
Quickly.
And so, you know, by implication, people like me are bad scientists. And so, you know, what you see is that not only do we not agree on the science of climate change, we don't even agree on what science is. You know, there's an argument over everything. And so, put all these things together, and you say, okay, well, you can't believe these guys. You can't believe these experts. They're in it for the money, they're immoral, they're bad scientists. So then, you know, who do we want to listen to? We want to listen to our experts. And so here's an example of part of the infrastructure of the alternate reality. So this is what, you know, when someone says, but I have these scientists over here, you can say, but I have something over here. And this is what's called the Global Warming Petition Project. And it's been going on for, I'd say, about 20 years now. And it's, I don't know if you can, probably can't read it, but it basically just says, we urge the United States government to reject global warming agreement as written in Kyoto. You can tell how old it is. Japan, December 1997, and other proposals, blah, blah, blah. There are no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will cause in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. And it's signed, you can't see this, by Edward Teller, who, father of the hydrogen bomb, who died, I think, in the early 2000s. So this is really quite old. Nevertheless, the important thing is, so they say we've got 31,000 American scientists. And then you can tell something right away when they say 9,000 have the PhDs, which mean that the vast majority of them don't have PhDs. You sort of say, well, what does it take to actually sign it? They say signatories are approved if they have obtained formal education degrees at the level of Bachelor of Science in appropriate scientific fields. So you don't actually have to know anything about climate to sign it. All you have to do is have a bachelor's degree in some field. And the way they kind of play the game is anybody who agrees with them, they'll go through some post hoc rationalization. You know, if you're a baker and you go to me and say, yeah, I think climate change is a hoax. They say, okay, well, you know, what's climate change? What's more like climate change than a scone in the oven? So this baker is obviously an expert. And so they, well, put him on the petition. But the important thing is, you know, as ridiculous as this is, I always show this to my students, and I say, when you guys graduate, you become an expert in climate, because they're all graduating with degrees in environmental studies or environmental geoscience, even though they might have taken one class in it. But the important thing is people use this, and this is the key part about the alternate reality. So once you have this brick out there, people can use it to build a house. This is Rick Perry, former governor of Texas. This was during his short-lived 2012 campaign, not to be confused with his short-lived 2016 campaign. And he said, so he was talking about climate change. So the Washington Post said, you know, why are you not worried? And so he says, Perry's spokesman sent us a link to something called the Petition Project, which claims to have collected the signatures of 31,000 American scientists, in quotes, which I love, on a petition that says there's no convincing evidence. The petition's a bit old, having been started in opposition to the 1997 agreement on global warming. But you see, the key thing is that that once you have this thing out there, people can then use it as part of the infrastructure to advance their argument of not believing science. So you can say, but we have all these scientists over here. Someone can say, but I've got this 31,000 American scientists sign this, and you know, they're scientists. Who was? He was an A&M graduate, yes. I don't mention that. Okay. That's right. It's not in my class. All right. So this is one way. So let's talk about some other examples of infrastructure. So there are a very small number of legitimate atmospheric scientists who dispute climate change. I would say there's 5 or 10 of them out there that have legitimate credentials. They publish in the peer-reviewed literature. They know stuff about the climate. And this is out of 1,000 scientists, maybe, give or take. So there's a very small number, and that's not unusual. Anybody who's an academic knows in every field there are a few people that are just out in the suburbs. I mean, plate tectonics, we've known plate tectonics is correct since the 60s when the data on seafloor spreading came. But, I think maybe the people that dispute that have all died by now. But for decades after that, there was a very small number of people who disputed that. And that actually doesn't tell you anything about what's right. What it tells you is about the foibles of human thinking, that there's always going to be a few people who sort of dispute what everyone else thinks. And so there are a few people that do this. But what happens is these people get endlessly recycled, and they show up everywhere. So examples, Roy Spencer, he's a scientist at University of Alabama, Huntsville. Judy Curry, she's a scientist at Georgia Tech. And they're both credentialed atmospheric scientists. I don't disagree with that. But the points they have are points that nobody else agrees with. I mean, it has people don't talk about their ideas. People just ignore them. And that's what scientists do with really crazy ideas. You just ignore it. And so, so the Texas Public Policy Foundation, this is a very right-wing, another think tank in Texas that pushes very conservative ideas. They wanted to have a session at a presentation they had on the state of the science. So it's a panel discussion. And so, of course, they have to bring in 2 people who dispute the science of climate change. Then they actually invited me to this. I couldn't make it. But they did find this one guy, Professor Yang from UT, and he's a legitimate scientist, and he sort of represented the mainstream. But realize what they're doing here is that they're setting up this debate as if there are these 2 equal sides. I could bring in one doctor who says smoking causes cancer and bring in another doctor who says smoking doesn't cause cancer. You could do that. And then you could have a debate between them. And, you could imply that there's this debate over whether smoking causes cancer. But in reality, one of them's a whack job. And, I won't call them whack jobs. I will say that their ideas, nobody considers Dr. Spencer and Dr. Curry's ideas to have much merit other than them. And so, you can set up, again, this is a fake debate. It's a fake debate between some people that nobody thinks is right, no scientists think are right, and a scientist who represents kind of the mainstream. And, it gives this impression that doesn't exist in reality. Because if you go to a scientific conference, you don't hear the arguments that they're having. You hear other arguments. And finally, I'll go quickly through this. This is the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the cover of the 4th assessment report. This is 2007. This is the one that split the Nobel Peace Prize. The IPCC split the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore in 2007. And this is the cover. And this has incredible incredible credibility in the policy debate, written by scientists, peer-reviewed, and it should, you could pick nits with it, but it basically represents what scientists think. And so if you're part of if you want to generate infrastructure of denial, you want to come out with your own report. And so, that's a 2013 cover. So here's the NIPCC, which my father calls the nitpick. This is the non-governmental international panel on climate change. That's right. And so you read it, it's just a lot of nonsense. And it's written by a couple guys. It's paid for by the Heartland Institute. And, it's again, so if I say, well, here I have the IPCC report, you can say, but I have this report. It weighs exactly as much. It's just as thick, but it's nonsense. I mean, it's like I can, it does, because the book has references in it and weighs 6 pounds, doesn't make it right. And this is my favorite one. So this is put out by the US GCRP. This is US Global Change Research Program. Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. This is put out by the Cato Institute. This is a think tank, and these are the exact same, except the difference is this is the temperature record since 1880, and they cut off, they only include the last 10 years down here. And the argument being that there's been no warming in 10 years. Anyway, so again, it's I have my report, you have your report. You have your scientists, I have my scientists. It's who knows what's right. This is a perfect example of the tobacco strategy. All right. So the question is why? Why do we do this? And this is, in some sense, this is the most interesting stuff that's come out. The science of climate change actually hasn't changed that much. I would say if you read a report from the late 70s and you beamed it back in time and showed the last IPCC report to them, they would be blown away by how much data we had, how fast our computers were, things like that. But they wouldn't see anything in there that surprised them. And in fact, in many ways, climate science hasn't changed in 30 or 40 years, which is one of the things that gives you confidence in it. If it were changing every year, you'd say we really don't understand it. So the fact that it's been repeatedly tested and hasn't really changed gives me at least confidence. But the thing that's new is there's a lot of social research on how people process information. And that's really what I'm going to talk about, stuff that's not my research, but stuff done by psychologists, and really explains why this stuff works. Okay, so we'll start off with a plot. This is how concerned you are about climate change. This is very concerned. This is not at all. And this is a way of judging where you fall on the political spectrum. So this is Bernie Sanders. This is Ted Cruz. I would put the Clintons I consider them sort of centrist, left of center. And you can see there's a really strong correlation. There's an obvious correlation. People who are very concerned are also liberal. People who are not concerned are conservative. And this is obvious. Anybody who turns on cable news knows this exists. And so you could ask yourselves, well, why does this exist? You can generate hypotheses. So one hypothesis is this idea that it's because people don't know enough science, that if we could somehow educate people on science, we could get rid of this polarization. So this is a hypothesis. And so what they've done here is this is the predictions. So these are people that don't know science. There's this huge gap. This egalitarian, communitarian are liberals. This hierarchical individualist is a conservative. So there's this big gap. But as we educate people, the gap will close. And the way this is drawn, they're agreeing up here. But maybe they agree here. Maybe they agree down here. But the point is, if you educate people, they should agree more. If it's just a lack of science knowledge that's driving the polarization. So you can test this by sorting the data and finding the people who understand the science best. And they've done that, and this is what they find. If you go to the people who know the science best, there's actually more polarization. The polarization increases among people who understand science the best. And that explains why trying to explain science to people doesn't bridge the gap. And that's why I said at the beginning, I don't talk a lot about science in these talks, because it doesn't convince anybody. People who are already convinced, they don't want to hear more. They're already convinced. People who are not convinced are not going to be convinced by science. So then the question is, what is it? If it's not a lack of knowledge of science, Why then do people disagree? And so we can do an experiment. So this is an experiment they did. So they gave people an example with skin cream. So they said patients who did use the new skin cream, 223, the rash got better, 75, the rash got worse. Patients who did not use a skin cream, 107 got better, 21 got worse. And this is basically almost a test of numeracy. And if you kind of run the numbers, you find that the skin cream doesn't work, because 80% get better if you don't use it, but only 75% get better if you do use it. Okay, so that's the way. That's it. Now they run the experiment with two different ways. Rash gets worse, rash gets better, to give both answers. Skin cream works, skin cream doesn't work. And then we can look at this as a function of how smart people are at math, their numeracy score. And you see, the people who are good at numbers get the right answer. And that makes sense. If you're really a good math person, you look at it and you say, okay, I'm going to calculate the ratios, and I'm going to figure out what the right answer is. Right, and then you know, these poor people down here, these people are getting less than 50%. That's sad. I mean, these people are getting about 50%, so that's about what you expect. All right, so now let's ask a question: is there any difference between how conservatives and liberals view the problem? There really isn't. If you're good with math, it doesn't really matter what your political philosophy is. And that's because skin cream has no political salience. There's nobody who cares about skin cream as part of how they think the world should operate. So let's do this. Let's do a slightly different experiment. Let's talk about banning handguns. And let's do exactly the same numbers. Cities that did ban handguns, 223 saw a decrease, 75% saw an increase. Cities that did not, 107 saw a decrease, 21 saw an increase. And so you can see that the ban decreased crime for 75%, no ban decreased crime for 80%. So if you're good at numbers, you're going to say the ban did not work, okay? And so again, they're going to do exactly the same thing. They're going to swap decrease in crime and increase in crime, so there's no bias in how the question is asked. And so now we can ask the question. This is again the skin treatment. Notice there's no difference. So now we can look at gun ban. And what you see is that if you show a blue is a liberal Democrat, if you show a liberal Democrat evidence that a gun ban decreases crime, they get the right answer. If you show a conservative Republican evidence that a gun ban increases crime, they get the right answer. You show them evidence that goes against what they want to see, they don't get the right answer. I mean, these people, they know the right answer because they're getting it right here, but they're getting the wrong answer because they don't want to see that. These people, they're hopeless. They're not going to get the right answer regardless of what they believe because they can't figure it out. So there's not a lot of difference there. But this really, I mean, I saw this talk given by, I should say this was research from Dan Kahan at Yale, and I saw him give a talk. And I was really blown away because it's one of those moments where as a scientist, you see data and you just think, of course, this is what's going on. Oh, I should go back. Anyway, yeah, okay, so, all right, so we go back here. This is sort of what's normal. So look at fluoridation of drinking water. Again, hierarchical individualists, these are conservatives, egalitarian communitarians, those are liberals. And, you know, this is fluoridation of water. How much risk do you believe it poses? And so, you know, you see a distribution. There are a few whack jobs that think fluoridation is really dangerous. But, you know, you don't see a big difference between political philosophies. You know, they kind of agree. And this is basically what you expect. This is medical x-rays. Again, you don't see a big difference. You know, you either believe it or you don't believe it, but it's really not affected by how you view the world should work. And then we look at climate, and you see something which is completely pathological. You know, let me go back. The black must be conservatives, the green must be liberal. You know, they completely disagree. And the thing that's important to realize, and this is the most important thing to realize, is this behavior is actually completely rational. You know, if you're a barber in South Carolina, or you're a congressman from a very conservative district, what good does it do you to talk about climate change and believe in it? You know, if you're a congressman, you're going to lose your job. If you're a barber, your clients are going to go, this guy's weird. I don't want to go have him cut my hair. You know why? And, you know, you don't really perceive a personal threat to you. And so, you know, what the rational thing to do is to not believe it. That's actually completely rational. But the problem is that if that's true, if that's rational for the individual, it's irrational for society. So in some sense, this is kind of like a tragedy of the commons. In fact, Dan Kahan calls it a tragedy of the scientific communication commons, where people are being individually rational, but the net result is society doesn't use the best available science to reach its conclusions. And so I'll just sort of say, I'll conclude by saying a few things. I think things are changing. So we're in this situation that I think is really bad, where you can't even have a discussion about climate change because you disagree on everything, not just the facts of climate, but on actually how science should work. But, and that basically is because of this, people reach conclusions by finding solutions that fit with their worldview. They don't actually evaluate the facts. So arguing facts with people does not work. And I do think, though, policymakers are becoming aware. And so this was actually just a few days ago in the New York Times. ExxonMobil investigated for possible climate change lies by New York Attorney General. And I think this is actually going to have a real impact on the people that are funding a lot of the alternate reality. That regardless of what happens to Exxon, it's a shot across the bow. Companies are going to realize that they could be held accountable, even if Exxon gets off. You know, you don't have to actually get hit by a bullet to be scared. And I think this could have a real effect on how companies talk about climate change in public. I also think the price of renewables is plummeting. And, you know, right now, wind is about $0.01 per kilowatt hour more than fossil fuel energy. And if you think about it, if you think, okay, this argument is over 1 cent per kilowatt hour more. And then, you know, I like to give a theoretical question to people. I say, imagine I came to you and said, I have a new energy source. It's going to save you 1 cent per kilowatt hour. That may be $200 a year. And you'd say, well, that's great. Let's do it. And I say, but there's one bad thing about it, or there's a couple of bad things about it. I mean, A, the pollution from it will kill tens of thousands of Americans every year, and it may change the climate and raise sea level, you know, a few feet by the end of the century and melt the Arctic ice cap. And, you know, it has these other bad things. You know, nobody would go for that, to save, you know, $100 or $200 a year. I mean, you know, there are probably a few people that would, but most people would say, no, it's okay. If it has all of those bad side effects, we'll stick with what we have now. But that's essentially the question we have. I mean, we're at this point where, you know, the renewables is getting close and the price is coming down. And I think in a few years, it may be that renewables are cheaper than, I mean, renewables are probably right now cost competitive with coal in a lot of conditions. I mean, coal's getting wiped out by natural gas. And it may be that renewables can compete with natural gas very, very soon. And then other countries, notably China, will put pressure on the U.S. I think climate denial is going to be harder and harder it will slowly become a less acceptable position. And then perhaps climate change will have what I sort of call the gay marriage moment. If you look at how fast the politics of gay marriage changed, climate change could be on the cusp of one of those, something that, you know, on the order of 5 years, everybody's sort of like falling over to become concerned about it. Because a lot of the demographics of climate and gay marriage are the same. You look at it supported by young people in both cases. And so I think a lot of political parties can look at that and see the future. And so I'll just wrap up there and be happy to take questions. Thanks.
Great. Please raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. Got a question right here.
Hello, I'm a student at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and currently my focus is in mathematics, but I do wonder, I mean, is the damage that's being done by climate change, I mean, is it just inevitable, or do you believe, without going completely back to pre-industrial revolution times, is there any way we can truly prevent the damage that essentially we bring about? I mean, is there any way to? Yeah,
that's a good question. And I want to, you know, when you talk about climate, you always want to give they always say don't depress the audience. So you know, here's my analogy. My analogy is, imagine you're driving down a road and the car ahead of you stops really fast. Maybe you're tailgating a little, and you realize immediately you're going to hit the car ahead of you. So the question is, what do? Well, you still hit the brakes because you want to hit the car ahead of you going as slowly as possible. And the longer you wait to the brakes, the more damage you're going to do. And that's very similar to the situation we're in right now. I mean, we're changing the climate. We've increased carbon dioxide from 280 parts per million pre-industrial to we just went over 400 parts per million now. And that is going to change the climate. We can't avoid that. So we're going to have some damage. This is absolutely unavoidable. The question we ask ourselves, though, is if we start now, we can head off very large warmings that are going to occur in the second half of this century. We can't do much about the climate for the next few decades. That's essentially baked into things we've already done. But we do have control over the stuff at the end of the 21st century. I mean, stuff for your kids. You might, given health, you might be alive. But so we do have a choice to make about what's going to happen. The other thing I like to emphasize is, and I haven't talked about this at all, is that once you emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it's effectively irreversible. And because carbon dioxide has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere, if we release a lot of carbon dioxide in the next few decades, we're going to warm the climate for the next 10,000 years. So people in the year 5000 could really be justifiably furious at us for not doing something about it, because we know what's happening. We know what we're doing. And, we have 50 years to make a decision about what we're going to do. And so we do have a lot of control, but we can't avoid everything. I mean, that's the problem. But we do have a choice to make about how much damage we're going to have. Just like, do you hit the brakes and you see the car ahead of you stop? Yeah, you do, because you want to hit it as slow as possible.
Yes, Rebecca.
Thank you. You talked a lot about how the conservative movement has mobilized its base to inaction on climate change. Can you talk a little bit about why you think the liberal environmentalists haven't motivated its base to take action against climate change?
I think actually they have, but I think that the status quo has a huge advantage in any policy argument. That doing nothing is always the easiest thing to do. And you can always, whenever an environmental policy comes up, you always see the same arguments, which is the science is uncertain and it's going to be ruinously expensive to make the change. And so you can essentially scare people into not doing anything. And then you have a lot of politicians who realize that their jobs are on the line, that if they vote to do something about it, they're going to lose their jobs. And I think maybe there are not enough Democrats who feel that way about climate change. So I think it's a very hard situation to motivate a change when one side really wants to do nothing. There are too many. Our government has too many ways to block action the way we think set up. You go to a place like China, they just declare we're going to do this, and they do it, and we can't do that.
Robert.
One of the things I've always thought was curious about this one, you brought up gun control and gay marriage, and I see why those issues appeal to liberals and progressives. I actually think climate change has a lot of appealing things to political conservatives. So I wonder if you ever kind of muse about the things that are natural to the issue that would be naturally appealing to conservatives.
Yeah, that's really a good point. And in fact, you think about it, climate change, maintaining the environment should mean a lot more to a really wealthy businessman than to a blue-collar steel mill worker. And in fact, for a long time, that was true. Nixon is a guy who started the EPA, but it all changed with Reagan. So Reagan is really the first person, and he has this quote. It's like government is, what do you say? Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. Something like that. And the problem with environmental issues is that they all require government intervention. And if you get to a point where you believe government intervention is morally evil, then how do you argue with that? I mean, how do you move that? And that turns out to be the argument that trumps everything else, no pun intended there. But that argument sort of is the dominant argument, sort of this idea that government is any government intervention is bad. even if it saves us from climate change. We'd rather have climate change than have the government intervene in our energy markets. That's effectively the argument people are making. And all of these other issues just are sunk by them. I mean, Republicans try to advance them, and they get voted out. They get called rhinos, Republican in name only. I mean, there are Republicans out there that try to advance. We can do conservative ways of addressing it, like a carbon tax. That really came out of Republican thinking about how do you have a market-oriented solution, and now it just gets obliterated if you come out. I mean, if you come out like that, you get pushed out of the party. You're a heretic.
Yes, sir. Question right here.
Do you see a correlation between how people view climate change and their religious beliefs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know there have been studies done. I'm trying to think of what the data show on that, and I cannot. I can't remember. People have looked at that, and I can't remember. I think if I can't remember it, then it probably suggests that there's not a super strong correlation. Certainly, you look at the evangelical community, certainly they would be really anti, because they're really the hardcore of the conservative movement. So I'm sure they would be, but religion in general, I think it's probably a weaker correlation, but I can't remember the data exactly.
Rob, you got a question back here? Rob Pillow has a question.
Thank you for speaking with us. My name is Rob Pillow, and I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. In March of this year, National Geographic released a magazine. On the front of it, it said "The War on Science," and this is obvious. This was obviously included in one of the topics that they talked about. I'm wondering, is it that polarized? Is there are we going to see in the future anytime science comes out, an immediate disagreement with science, just because it's scientific, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people disagree with it because it's scientific. I think what people have learned, and this is sort of in some sense one of the most depressing things, what people have learned is that you can have a bunch of experts work on something and figure out something like, this is right. We've been working on this for a long time. But you can challenge it. You can have a PR firm come in and you can form a phony tobacco institute and you can just challenge it. And so I think that, but you don't do that just because it's science. You do that because you want to stop what the science says. So if you show me that tobacco is harmful, I don't want people to believe that. So I'm going to do something about that. You show me climate change is bad. I don't want that to, that implies we need to do something. The government needs to do something with energy. I don't like that, so we're going to do it. So I do think that there is particularly in certain segments of society, science is less respected. Science is still generally respected, but less so in certain views, especially if you go to the really most conservative groups. They view college professors as, Ivy League, ivory tower intellectuals, and and I think people often sort of will ask, what's my political affiliation? And the thing about it is, I'm actually really sort of in the middle, but I've become more Democratic over time, not because mainly because of the way Republicans are. It's like I feel like I can't possibly be a Republican because of the way they deal with science. I mean, how can you be part of a party that carries such low esteem for the stuff you're doing? And so I think there's a cause and effect there, that sort of the harsher they become, the more science moves away. And I am worried a little bit about the fact that, there's that sort of one segment of society views science so negatively. I think that can't help but be bad for society. And there are a lot of issues in which people don't really trust science. Vaccines, GMOs, things like that. I mean, it's really quite irrational in a lot of respects.
Yes. Right here.
Hi, my name is Xochitl Delgado Solerson. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. Do you know if other countries use the same tactics to discredit climate change, and if the divide is also between liberals and conservatives, or is it different?
Yeah, it's the U.S. and Australia are the two countries that have the kind of argument that's going on right now. And those, the U.S. and Australia are actually very similar, and Canada to a certain extent, although they just kicked out their prime minister. And those are similar countries in the sense that they're big, they're resource extractors. Australia digs up a lot of coal and sends it to China. Canada has the tar sands. The U.S. has a lot of oil. And so those are countries that don't, there's a lot of political pressure in those countries to not do something about climate change. So you see very similar arguments. You go to other countries, Europe, you just don't see this. In England, there's a little bit, but not nearly to the same degree as the U.S. So it's not global, but it is definitely just a few places where you really see the kind of polarization that exists in the U.S.
Okay, question.
Yeah, you said something about the people who are not convinced are not going to be convinced by science. That's really depressing. I'm a professor. It's really depressing. So actually, when I'm going to class and I'm going to present the lectures, you're telling me that actually they're already convinced. That's my first part. And the second part, connect with what he said. It was about National Geographic was bought recently by a certain individual. Are you afraid that National Geographic will switch to the dark side?
I don't, to be honest, I have no idea what National Geographic will do. As far as your other question, that's really interesting. I think in general, people are convinced by evidence, but there are certain politically salient topics. So you show the skin cream, people don't care about skin cream, so they look at the data and they draw a conclusion. But there are certain topics on which they don't do that. If they really view that their worldview or their acceptance in the group is threatened, so gun control, climate change, abortion, you can think of all the sort of the hot button topics. In that case, people don't reason with data. Now, I will say that, what?
So what do you do?
Well, okay, so as a faculty member, I do believe that over a semester you can convince people. You can't convince people in 5 minutes and you can't convince people in an hour. But I think over a semester you can slowly wear them down. On the other hand, I find that most of the people that take my climate class are people that are concerned about the issue. You actually don't get the people who you really want to reach. I don't know, beyond that, I don't know that there's a lot that we can do. I think it's these, essentially what you need to do is you need to take the political salience out of the issue. You need to explain to them that climate change, there are a million issues that the government does. I mean, the government does lots of stuff. It bans benzene and wood products, and it has regulations on milk production. And, these are, nobody cares about that. I mean, everybody accepts that. You just have to, somehow we have to convince people that climate change is just another issue that the government does. I don't really know how you get to that, but you sort of show people, in Florida, people are concerned about sea level rise, and they're concerned, they're concerned about hurricane impacts. And so sort of politicians of all stripes, they don't talk about climate change, but they talk about, we need to do stuff to protect our coastlines and do stuff like that. And so you kind of take it out of being an argument over identity politics. But I would say just sort of keep teaching. I mean, there's not a lot as a faculty member we can really do about that.
I know there are a lot more questions, and I hope people will come up and visit with Andy at the conclusion. But I just want to say that this is his first trip to Arkansas, and obviously he has spurred a great deal of interest, not only by your attendance, but by your questions. We're glad to have you here. I also want to point out that you are in the oldest building in Arkansas that is LEED certified. So this is an 1899 train station that is LEED certified.
They were ahead of their time.
So, well, they weren't LEED certified in 1899, but we did get there, and I think it proves that historic preservation, education, and the environment can work together. Let's give Andy a round of applause.
I was thinking about saying, if A&M had lost, it's hard to say, well, I lost a bet. So.
Yeah.